So how much fat should you eat on a plant-based diet? Therefore, how much fat do I actually eat on a plant-based diet every single day? And why do I actually disagree with some of the respected figureheads in my own space that argue for a much smaller proportion of one's daily calories coming from fat? Well, firstly, allow me to contextualize by sharing with you what I actually agree with many of my peers in the plant-based community on. Number one, fat's high calorie content makes it more fattening, arguably, than the other two macronutrients, of course those being carbohydrates and protein, given 9 calories per gram of fat versus only 4 calories, so over double in carbohydrates and protein. So certainly agree that we could say fat, based purely if we're isolating the calorie factor here, is the most quote-unquote fattening, or let's be fair on this, likely to be fattening, because this is highly contextual to what the rest of your diet or a given meal looks like, of course. So agree on that first debate point. Undoubtedly. I will also agree with many of my peers in the plant-based community that rightly, I think, say that excess calories consumed from fat are more likely to be stored as body fat versus excess calories consumed from the other two macronutrients, especially from carbohydrate. We know, depending on glycogen store levels, that actually excess calories coming from carbohydrate are far less likely to be stored as body fat versus excess calories coming from fat, which is a wonderful thing. So again, we can say maybe in terms of an efficiency of body fat storage, yes, indeed, dietary fat is the worst of those 3 macronutrients, especially when you compare it, contrast it with carbohydrates. So again, agree on these points that you'll often hear, again, from some of my peers. Where I disagree though, and one thing that I've found as a practitioner getting deeper and deeper, more advanced into lessening body fat over the years, my own personal, let's say, health journey, and of course now having the pleasure to work with over 650 men and women across the world eating a plant-based diet. The insight that this has given me that I didn't necessarily have myself when I was maybe 30 or 40 pounds heavier than I am right now, is the leaner I get, the more percentage of my diet is made from fat, the more satisfied I actually feel. In other words, this was way less pronounced, it was subsequently way less problematic earlier on in my weight loss journey. But what I found here is the leaner I've got, the more important that having a decent, and I'm going to come on to numbers in just a second, I'll get precise with my recommendations here, but having a decent amount of calories coming from fat has been absolutely critical. Why? Because fat is incredibly slow digesting versus the other two macronutrients. Now, there are other variables. There are other variables that affect thermic effect, that affect, speed of digestion. But with fat, that little bit of fat being present in my meals, it slows down the digestion of some of those calories. In other words, let's say the distribution at which I'm or the time distribution of calories being metabolized versus the point of consumption. This is really stretched out with a little bit more fat in my diet. Now, of course, this is wildly anecdotal, or my personal experience rather. It's based on scientific principle, but my personal anecdote here is, yes, anecdotal, of course. But what I have found, in other words, is that the leaner that I get, the less body fat I have, the less full, subsequently, my glycogen stores are, the less hunger I actually experience when my fat is increased very, very slightly versus a conventional low-fat diet as prescribed by some figureheads, some respected figureheads in my community with maybe 10, maximum 15% of calories coming from fat. What I've found is when I go a little bit higher than this, I actually stay more satisfied for the same calorie point. Yes, again, this is anecdotal, and no, not all fat sources enable this great boost to satiety for me personally. So oil is a great exception to this. But let's really nail this down to whole plant food, of course, sources of fat. So avocado, nuts, seeds primarily, a little bit of tahini I have from time to time in my diet, beyond trace amounts of fat in tofu, of course, which is more rich in fat per calorie per gram also than the other beans. Chickpeas quite high in fat actually relative to the bean. It's not high in fat, but relative to the bean category. But generally speaking, versus other legumes, if you're to compare, tofu has a greater percentage of calories coming from fat. What this has allowed me to do is raise my fat intake to around around 20% of total calories consumed and actually feel more satisfied than I do at, say, 10 to 15%. So just that little boost. Now, in nutrition research standards, 20% of calories coming from fat is still considered a low-fat diet. I want to be clear. So I'm not sat here today saying something massively controversial in my community that, hey, you need to do keto. That's really, there is some nuance here. I'm not saying, some people hear my argument on this and they think, oh, you're talking about a high-fat diet, mate. You're talking about a high-fat diet, right? No, absolutely. Still a low-fat diet, just not an ultra-low-fat diet. And this, for me, the leaner that I've got, the more I'm messing with those hunger signals. Indeed, just having that little bit of fat and subsequently feeling more satisfied for longer, slowing that digestion time. It's been really, really beneficial. If I eat a meal that's very, very carbohydrate rich, especially, not so much with protein, this doesn't feel as pronounced, but very, very carbohydrate rich, especially, and I'm not fearful of carbohydrates, nor do I wish to play into that bandwagoning, but that little bit of fat on an otherwise carb-focused meal, wow, the difference in how long I'm satiated after that meal is really quite phenomenal. Even if we're talking about plus 100 calories, even plus 70 calories from an overt fat-rich plant food like avocado, nuts, seeds, tahini, etc., etc. So, in other words, what am I saying here? Because I'm just kind of saying the same point using different examples. Going around in circles slightly, forgive me. But that little bit more fat in my diet has actually been amazing for dropping even more weight. And no, I must concede, 20, 30, 40 pounds heavier, this didn't feel as necessary to me. For whatever reason, glycogen stores being more full, body fat there, so the cortisol signaling, alarm bells ringing, your super low body fat, that pushback, that internal pushback from the body, when we start to get quite lean, you know, for whatever reason, it didn't feel as crucial to me to be around 20% of calories coming from fat. I could run the low-fat principles for a long time. But now, at a leaner point, with a finer, what feels to me like a finer margin between weight loss and maintenance at a more advanced stage of fat loss, indeed, just that little bit more fat than is prescribed by some. Again, not all. I actually have a relatively low-fat diet versus some plant-based practitioners, but versus, let's say, the high-carb, low-fat figureheads in my movement, I've just found increasing the calories from fat slightly has been a godsend. And I want to be very clear here. I'm not talking about an increase in total net calories consumed, total net calories, same thing, but net calories consumed. That's not what I'm talking about. So I'm not talking about adding fat to the diet and allowing the calories to stack. I'm talking about a very fair comparison that I've split tested over years. Literally every day I split test this. I'm my own experiment, I must say. I've split tested this for years on a meal by meal basis. And even keeping total calories of 2 meals the same, but just allowing a little bit more fat in one meal than the other, but again, net calories exactly the same, otherwise it's not really a fair experiment, is it? And my levels of satiation are to whatever percentage, it's hard to put a number on it, but at 10, 15%, I'm certainly not going to say 30, I'm not going to make any wild claims that I'm 50% more satiated, but just that little boost of satisfaction. Again, forgive me, I'm going in circles here, just really driving home that yeah, I don't actually agree. I do draw the line, and I think about 20% of calories coming from fat I found to be wildly beneficial. So when I want to lose body fat, I eat about 23, maximum 2,400, sometimes down to 22. I'm not anal about it, 2,200 calories per day, and it does change on a day-to-day basis, and I'm not too... I know I sound precise in this video, but like I'm obsessed with the calorie tracking. No, I'm not actually that pedantic about it. I'm just throwing numbers at this to give you kind of my framework here. And no, 2,300 is likely not a suitable calorie amount to you. This is not advice, this is not prescriptive. I'm just sharing my reflections here. But my standard calorie deficit of 2,300 calories to lose some body fat, if I'm in a fat loss phase, for me, I'm looking at around 60 grams of fat per day, just being a wonderful sweet spot that is slightly above, again, that 10 to 15% range, more like 20%. And for me, honestly, I know it's a subtle difference between 10, 15% and 20%. For me, it's actually made it's made quite a significant enough difference for me to take this stance so proactively on the internet. A significant enough difference to make this video speaking on this particular point, as I've done many, many times. It is not a trivial improvement in my satisfaction levels, let's put it like that. It's not a game changer. It's not like my own version of GLP-1 medication, a GLP-1 drug, but for me, a little bit more fat. It's been a godsend. So that's how much fat I personally eat per day. Again, not prescriptive, not advice, but this is my reasoning as to why I prefer just a little bit more fat than is sometimes in some corners of the plant-based space commonly advised.